Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Lamed quotes various quotes from the Mishnah and explains each of them. The primary sugya over here is how do you make an Eruv Tchumen or an Eruv Chatzeres? What kind of food do you have to set aside? So first the Gemara is discussing does the amount of food matter from person to person. Then the Gemara will discuss a few food items if they're usable. The Gemara will then talk about water and salt. Do they count as mozain, or do they count as zon, or do they count as neither? The Gemara will explain what that is. Then the Gemara will get into somebody who makes a neder. And there's two languages of neder. What is he forbidding on himself for each of them? The Gemara then goes back to the halachos of Eruvin, and the Gemara discusses if the food that you're using for the Eruv has to be edible to you, to somebody, or potentially edible to you, or it doesn't matter, or if it shouldn't even be food at all. There are about 5 different opinions there. The Gemara will compare and contrast the opinions. So we go to the beginning of the daf. The Gemara is quoting a brisa of Rav Shimon ben Elazar. Shimon ben Elazar says the amount of food that you have to set aside for an Eruv has to be relevant to each person or more lenient. So somebody who is old and doesn't eat too much for a Suda. Somebody who is sick also needs less than a normal amount. However, somebody who eats a lot, and for him 2 meals is a tremendous amount of food, you don't have to give the amount of food that he would normally eat. You just give a normal amount of food. And therefore we go leniently in this halacha. So the Gemara says this seems to contradict a different brisa of Shimon ben Elazar talking about a different halacha. So halacha that if there is a mace, a dead corpse inside a house, so it transfers tumah to everything within the house. What about the doorway? What about the thickness of the doorway, the space of the doorway? So it only transfers tumah to a doorway that this mace might be carried out through. Any doorway that you could reasonably assume that the mace is not coming out through that doorway's space is not counted as part of the oil, and the mace is not metameh just because he's in the building. Now, how do you calculate what doorway he's going to go through? So if Shimon ben Elazar says it has to go by his relative size. If he's a very big person, then he has to go out of a doorway that fits him. If it's a doorway that would fit a normal person but wouldn't fit him, let's say for example you have Oig Melech HaBashan there, so then it wouldn't be counted as a doorway that he would go out through. The only doorway that would be Tameh would be the one that he could go through, and that would be the only one that's large enough. So you see, he says that it does matter. Big people do get a bigger share. So how come here in our discussion of Eruvin, he says small, he says that big people do not get a larger share? So Abaye says, what do you mean? How can you compare the two? Over there, you can't get the mace out through a smaller doorway. The halacha depends on which doorway he's going through. He's not going through the smaller doorway. Over here, we're just trying to decide what counts as a normal way of setting up your own rishus, so we don't follow every single individual's preferences. You want to set up where your primary residence is for Shabbos. That's where a normal person, the amount of food that a normal person would consider to be a primary residence. It doesn't have to be specific to you. So Gemara says, is there an opinion that argues on Shimon ben Elazar as far as this halacha of which doorway the mace is going to go through? Is there an opinion that says, no, every single person has the same size doorway? The halacha is that if a doorway is 4 tvachim, it's considered to be large enough for a mace to go through, and therefore we have to assume that the tumah is coming out through there. So is there an opinion that applies that even to a very large individual? So the Gemara wants to say yes. It's the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, who seems to paskin that even Oig Melech HaBashan could come out through a 4 tefach size doorway, and therefore every 4 tefach size, if you have a 4 tefach size opening in a house, then the space of that doorway is tamei tumas oil because the mace might come out through there. If Rabbi Yochanan says that way, he's obviously not arguing on the Tana of Shimon ben Elazar unless the Chachamim hold away. So then we can infer from there that there is a Chachamim that argues on Shimon ben Elazar. So this is not necessarily. It could be that the case that Rabbi Yochanan is referring to was where none of the doorways fit the mace, and this 4 tefach one is the largest one. You could assume that they're going to have to enlarge the doorway to get the mace out. They're not going to cut him up. The one that they're going to enlarge is that 4 tefach doorway, and therefore that's going to be the one that he's going to go through. All the other ones you could assume he's not going to go through. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan is referring to. But he would agree that if you have one doorway that fits him and the other ones do not, even if they're 4 tvachim, you could assume that he'll go out through the one that fits him, just like Shimon ben Elazar said. Okay, now back to Hilchos Eruvin. The Gemara says that can you make an eruv with raw meat? So the Gemara quotes Rav that you can. Can you make an eruv with raw eggs? The Gemara quotes Rav Chia that you can. How many raw eggs? The Gemara quotes Rav Yosef, who the Gemara calls a Sinai because he knew everything said on Sinai. You need at least 2 raw eggs. Okay, the Gemara now refers back to the Mishnah, which said halacha about water and salt. It said that somebody who says, I swear that I'm not going to eat any mazoin, I'm not going to eat any filling food, is allowed to eat water and salt. Water and salt doesn't count as mazoin. So the Gemara says this seems to be a proof against Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel had said halacha that the bracha of boyer minim mizoinois only goes on the 5 grains. Those are the only things that are called mazoin. You see from our Mishnah that everything is called mazoin except for water and salt, even fruits. So you should say the bracha of mizoinois on fruits, which is against Rav and Shmuel. So Gemara says, well, we already proved in Masechta Brachos, we already said that the halacha is not like Rav and Shmuel. So Gemara says, okay, but we could prove it from here as well. Gemara says, no, not necessarily. There's 2 different things. There's food that's called mazain, that means filling food, and then there's something which actually fills you up. That's called hazon. Mazain and hazon are not the same thing. You could have something that is zon, but it's not mazain. It fills you up, but it wouldn't be classified as a filling food. So, therefore, it would work as follows. This Mishnah is saying that the only things which are not zon are oil, are water and salt. They will never fill you up. So that's not zon. Now, fruits will always count as something that fills you up. They count as a zon. However, Rav and Shmuel are correct that they're not called a mazain. They're not called a filling food. That far we would not say. So now the Gemara has another kash over here. It's a statement also brought in Masechta Brachos. Interesting incident. The Gemara says that Rabbi Bar Chana says we followed Rav Yechanan to eat the fruits of Genosar, an area around the Kinneret that has very delicious fruits. And we picked 1,000 fruits for him. It was either 10 people picked 100 each, or 100 people picked 10 each, and they were big fruits. You couldn't fit 100 of them in a basket of 3 saw. And he said that I swear that I didn't taste the amount of fullness, meaning I'm not full. So you see that fruits don't fill you up. The Gemara says, no, again, it's possible that all he said was that it's not mazain, it's not a filling food. But he didn't go so far as to say that it's not something that could fill you up, that it's not zon. On the subject of making a neder to make something forbidden to you, the Gemara now discusses what if somebody forbids certain food to himself, is he allowed to use it as an eruv? So the Gemara is going to go with the following assumption. As long as he is saying that he's forbidden only to eat it, he's still allowed to use it as an eruv. We're not getting into the machlokas as to whether you have to be able to eat the food. We're going to assume that even though you can't eat it, you can still use it as an eruv. The problem becomes when you can't get any hano from it. You're not allowed to benefit anything from it. So Rav Huna says it depends on your language. If you say that I swear I'm not going to eat this, so then hana, benefit is permitted, you're allowed to use it for an eruv. If, however, you say this thing is forbidden to me, kikerzu alai, the word forbidden is implied. If you say this thing is forbidden to me, that implies that it's forbidden both for eating and for hana. Then you wouldn't be able to even use it for an eruv, because that would be a hana. So Rav Huna's main chiddush is that when you say that this thing is forbidden to me without specifying, then that also includes hana, and you're not allowed to use it at all for anything whatsoever. So the Gemara has a kasha on. That's from a brisa. Brisa says that somebody who says that I promise, he swears against a loaf of bread. The language is hanoider min hakikar. It doesn't specify whether he said I'm not going to eat it or he said it is usher to me. It doesn't specify the language, and the Gemara is going to prove later that the language that it should be referring to is where he says it's forbidden to me, which is Rav Huna's case. Still, the brisa seems to say you're allowed to use it for an eruv. So it's a kasha on Rav Huna. So Rav Huna says, no, that's not what happened here. What happened here is that he said I swear I'm not going to eat this. He didn't say that it is forbidden to me. And I'll prove it to you, because the end of the sentence says that this is referring to a situation where he said I'm not going to taste from it. That was what he promised. So, and that's why he's not allowed to eat it. However, had he said this is forbidden to me, then that would imply even that it's forbidden for any hana, and then it would be asur altogether. You couldn't use it for an eruv. So Gemara says, so then if so then the second half of the brisa that says that if he says this thing is like hektish, that's a language of Isser Hanal, and then he can't use it for an Erev. So why does the Gemara have to go to that far case where he says this is to me like hektish? You have a very similar case. Instead of saying I'm not going to eat it, he said it is forbidden to me. That's a much closer case. We always want to contrast within as close a scenario as we can. So Rav Huna says, well, what do you mean? But I proved you from the beginning. It said that the situation in which it's forbidden, the situation in which it's permitted to use for an Erev is where he said, I'm not going to taste it. I already proved to you that that's what the case was. The Gemara answers, okay, we'll have to adjust the wording of the Mishnah a little bit, the Brisa a little bit to fit. It's really talking about Rav Huna's case, where someone said this loaf of bread is forbidden to me, and it rules against Rav Huna. It rules that even when somebody says that he only means to make it asar be'achila, not asar b'hana, only forbidden to eat, and therefore he's allowed to use it for an Erev, and that's why it says he's allowed to use it for an Erev. The language where he says, because he said that I'm not going to eat it, what it means is that it's as if he had said specifically and clearly, I'm not going to eat it. The language of it's forbidden to me is the same as I'm not going to eat it, and that's why he's allowed to use it for an Erev, because it's not asar b'hana. We're forced to say this, because otherwise, why would we have to go running to hektish for a case that's forbidden? So, anyway, the Gemara says it's a kasha on Rav Huna. So Gemara says Rav Huna will say, I have another Tana to hide behind. There's a Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, either of a brisa where Rabbi Eliezer says, if somebody says, I swear I'm not going to eat this loaf of bread, you're allowed to use it for an Erev. But he says, this loaf of bread is forbidden to me, you're not allowed to use it for an Erev. So you see, he says like me. Gemara says, but it can't be, because there's another statement, there's another brisa quoting Rabbi Eliezer who says exactly the opposite. That brisa quotes the Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer. The Tanakama says, this is the rule, anything which a person forbids upon himself is just forbidden to eat, so he's allowed to use it for an Erev. Anything which is innately forbidden to him is forbidden in all ways, and he's not allowed to use it for an Erev. Rabbi Eliezer says, clearly, somebody says that this loaf of bread is forbidden to me, without specifying, or if he says that it's hektish, either of these two, you're not allowed to use it for an Erev. It's asar b'hana, clearly against Rav Huna. Gemara says it's a machlekes tanoim what Rabbi Eliezer really said, and Rav Huna holds that this Tana is correct, that Rabbi Eliezer holds that you're allowed to, and he goes against that other brisa that you asked from before. The Gemara now refers back to the Mishnah and gets into the sugya of you're allowed to use food which is forbidden for the person that's trying to make an Erev. So we had seen a number of opinions in our Mishnah. We're going to see now that there are more opinions. First of all, in our Mishnah we had the Tanakama's opinion who said you're allowed to use food that's forbidden to you as long as it's permitted to somebody else. That the examples of that were that a Nazir is allowed to use wine, even though he's not allowed to drink wine, and a Yisrael is allowed to use Truma, even though he's not allowed to eat Truma. So the Gemara says this does not fit with Beis Shammai's opinion. It appears to be that this is only Beis Hillel. Why? Because we have a discussion between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai on the subject. The Gemara is going to later change what this discussion was, but this first version is as follows. Beis Shammai says you're not allowed to use wine for a Nazir or Truma for Yisrael. Beis Hillel says you are to make an Erev. So the Gemara, the Mishnah continues, records the conversation between the two. Beis Hillel says, I don't understand you, Beis Shammai. Don't you agree that on Erev Yom Kippur you want to make an Erev Chatzeres or an Erev Tchumen for Yom Kippur, that you're allowed to use food? Even though there's an adult who's planning to use the Erev, he's not allowed to eat it on Yom Kippur. So Beis Shammai says, yeah, we agree. So Beis Hillel says, well, if you're allowed to do that, only because it's obviously the reason is because it's permitted to a child, so then a Nazir should be allowed to use wine because it's permitted to everybody else, and a Yisrael should be allowed to use Truma because it's permitted to Kohanim. So Gemara explains Beis Shammai is not impressed by that argument, because Beis Shammai says at least now the food is edible to you when Yom Kippur is beginning, up until the moment that Yom Kippur begins. At the moment of beginning, up till then, it's still permitted. That's why you're allowed to use it. That's why it establishes your primary residence, as opposed to wine for a Nazir or Truma for Yisrael, where he's not allowed to eat it not Friday, not Shabbos, not any day, not every Yom Kippur, not any time. So the Gemara says this is all one version of Beis Shammai's opinion. Hanani has a different version. Hanani says Beis Shammai didn't hold that you have to use food that you're allowed to eat. Beis Shammai held you're not allowed to use food altogether. You want to set up your permanent residence somewhere and make that your Erev. That can only be if you bring all your stuff there. You have to bring your clothing there, your bed there, all your whole house. You have to move there. the fact that you leave some food there doesn't count. So Gemara says, hold on a second. I have a brisa. Who is the author of this brisa? The brisa says that whatever clothing you set up for an Eruv, that's what you're allowed to use on Shabbos. You're not allowed to use the rest of your clothing that wasn't set up for the Eruv. So if you made the Eruv with black clothing, you're not allowed to use your white clothing. If you made the Eruv with your white clothing, you're not allowed to use your black clothing. So Gemara says, it must be Beis Shammai, according to Chananya. You have to use the clothing, and if you didn't use the white clothing, it's not included in the Eruv. So Gemara says, hold on a second. Beis Shammai, according to Chananya, says you have to put all your clothing there. So not if you didn't use the white clothing in the Eruv, then you can't use not the white clothing, not the black clothing for the Eruv, for carrying or for walking or wearing. You're not allowed to do anything. You don't have a valid Eruv. You didn't bring all your stuff there. So Gemara changes and here says, yeah, that's what we meant to say here. That if somebody made it with black clothing only, then he can't use his black. Then he can't wear his black clothing or his white clothing. And when he's using the Eruv, because he's not allowed to use the Eruv altogether. Now refers to the opinion of Sumchas in the Mishnah. Sumchas had said that in the case of the Nazir using wine, that I agree. The Nazir is allowed to use wine because other people are allowed to use the wine. In the case of the non-Kayin, the Yisrael, using Truma, that he disagreed and he said, no, that's no good. So Gemara says, why? What's the difference? Gemara says that Sumchas' opinion is as follows. It has to be something which you could theoretically make accessible to yourself. A Nazir could go to a Chacham and have his Naziris resolved. He could ask for a heter on his shvuah and on his vow of Nazirus, and then he could have it removed, and then he would be able to drink the wine. So he could potentially access the wine. Levi and Yisrael can never become Kahanim, and therefore they'll never be able to access the Truma, and therefore it doesn't work as an Erev for them. So the Gemara says, but hold on a second, but they could take off the Truma. They can make it non-Truma by going to a Chacham and getting a heter of the neder that makes it Truma. When you make some fruits designated as Truma, that's a type of neder. You could take that off. So Gemara says, but that wouldn't help you. If you take off the neder, it doesn't make it mutter. It's not Truma, but it's tevel now. It's untrumad fruits. You still wouldn't be able to eat it. Gemara says, so why is that a problem? So he'll take off Truma. He'll say that there's Truma somewhere else. In my house, I have some fruits over there. That's Truma on this. So Gemara says, no, we know that Talmidei Chachamim never take off Truma from something. They never use as Truma something which is not near them. Because if you say something somewhere else is the Truma on this, and therefore I can eat this, that's risking it. How do you know that those fruits are still around? Maybe they got destroyed. And then you haven't taken Truma, and you're not allowed to eat this. So therefore he wouldn't do something like that. So Gemara says, but okay, so then in the Erev itself, let him separate a little bit off to the side and say this is Truma on this. How much is Truma already? A tiny bit works midaraisa, and even midarabanan it could be as little as 1/60th. So Gemara says, yeah, but we're talking about a case where he set up exactly 2 sudas, 2 meals worth, and therefore he can't spare any for Truma. So Gemara says, well, how do you know? Why would you say this, that's what's happening here, and limit the understanding of the mission to this and have Sumchas argue? Let's not say that's the case. Sumchas seems to argue in all cases. He doesn't seem to say, well, maybe we're talking about this case and therefore I argue. Sumchas gives a general rule. You're ending up limiting Sumchas' argument to a very strange case. That you can't do in a Mishnah. So Gemara tries a new approach. Gemara says, okay, no, you can't take off the Truma because you wouldn't be able to eat it. It would be tevel. And if you ask me that you can make Truma again from somewhere else, you can't, because you're not allowed to make Truma on Shabbos. You're not even allowed to make Truma beinish mashos. Even though it's only an Isser D'Rabbanan, you're still not allowed to set aside Truma on beinish mashos when it's about to begin. So now the Gemara says, okay, let's analyze some chus over here. We have a Mishnah that says, well, we don't know who this is, but we're wondering maybe it is some, because we have a Mishnah that lists a number of things that apply for each person specifically. How much is Kemitza on a carbon mincha? It depends on the Kohen. How much does the Kohen Hagadol have to take a Ketores for Yom Kippur? Depends on the size of his hands. How much is a swallow that you are violating the Isser of eating on Yom Kippur? That depends on the size of your mouth. How much food do you need to set aside for an Erev? That depends on how much you eat. So that sounds like Sumchus says it has to be specific for each individual. It has to be accessible for each individual. It can't be that's good for somebody else. Somebody else could eat it. Sumchus holds it has to be that this person could eat it somehow. He could access it. So Sumchus seems to hold that it's got to be for each individual. So the Gemara says yes, could be that is Sumchus. So the Gemara says so now maybe this argues on Shimon ben Elazar, who we saw all the way back in the beginning of the daf, who said that even though a sick person, you only need the amount of food that he would eat, and an old person, you only need the amount of food that he would eat, but a very hungry person who eats a very lot, you don't have to have the amount of food that he would eat, you could have a normal amount. So that would seem to disagree with this opinion of Sumchus over here. So, because he says that it's not specific to him. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. It could be that really it is very specific. Just that this person is 1 in a million, and his personal eating habits don't count as a real thing. It's badla daita etel kol adam. It's not significant, and therefore it doesn't count. But if you would have a real variation, and some people are like this and some people are like that, it would be specific to the individual. The Gemara now refers back to the Mishnah where we discussed an Eruv which is placed in a place which is inaccessible, and that is, first, it's a Kohen who's making the Eruv, and the Eruv is placed in a base of pras. That's a field which contained a body, and it was plowed in. And Midrabanan were afraid that it scattered pieces of the bones around the field, therefore you can't walk there. So Gemara had said that that's okay because the Kohen could blow the ground. The Chachamim said you're allowed to blow the ground as you walk, and therefore any big pieces of the bones you'll see, and any small pieces will get blown out of the way. Also, the halach is, Gemara adds here that if a base of pras, this area is walked by a lot of people, you assume any bones that are there are trampled and crushed, and it's not metame anymore if it's less than the minimum size, which is that of a barley. Now the Gemara quotes the next thing, which is Rabbi Yehuda said that you can even set up an Eruv for a Kohen in a graveyard. The Gemara says, well, how's he going to get it? The Gemara says, well, he could theoretically put himself in a crate, a box, or a shipping container and be carried in there. And he's like the opinion that holds that a moving ohel counts as an ohel. In order for it to protect him from tumah, it has to be halachically called an ohel. That way the tumah is outside the ohel and he's inside the ohel, so it blocks it. But if it's moving, does that really count as an ohel? Ohel is a tent that's supposed to be real estate. It's not supposed to move. So the Gemara quotes a machlokes about that. Rabbi says that it does not work, and Rabbi Yossi says that Rabbi Yehuda says that it works, and they're referring to somebody who wants to walk into Eretz Ha'amim like that. Eretz Ha'amim, the land of the nations, is assumed to have tumah all over it. So again, the issue over there is a moving oil. Does that work? And that's the same issue over here. Similarly, Rabbi Yehuda has another brisa where he says you could even have an Eruv placed on top of a grave. And again, how's he going to get to it? He'll be in this enclosed carriage, crate, or box, and that's how he's going to get there, and that's why the Eruv is good.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.